The youth mental health crisis. What Freud would say about our anxious generation. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. and 16-year-old Sarah is scrolling through Instagram while her chemistry homework sits untouched. Her heart races as she sees her classmates posting about their perfect lives, their college acceptances, their seemingly effortless success. She closes the app, opens TikTok, then Snapchat, then back to Instagram. 3 hours later, she's still awake, more anxious than when she started, and her homework remains untouched. Sarah isn't alone. In fact, she's part of a generation experiencing unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression. According to recent studies, nearly 40% of high school students reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness, while anxiety disorders affect over 30% of adolescents. These aren't just statistics. There are kids struggling with invisible battles that previous generations didn't face at this scale. But here's the thing. If Sigmund Freud were alive today, he wouldn't be surprised by this crisis at all. In fact, he'd probably say he saw it coming from a mile away. What Freud would say, the unconscious rebellion. Let's bring Freud into this conversation, shall we? The father of psychoanalysis spent his career uncovering the hidden forces that drive human behavior. And if he were observing today's youth mental health crisis, he'd have some fascinating insights. First, Freud would tell us that anxiety and depression aren't just random brain malfunctions. They're symptoms. Think of them like a car's check engine light. They're telling us something important is happening under the hood. But instead of looking at the engine, we often just try to cover up the warning light. Freud would say that today's youth are experiencing what he called neurotic anxiety. Anxiety that comes from internal conflicts between what they want, what they think they should want, and what society demands of them. It's like having 3 different GPS systems in your head, all giving you different directions, while you're desperately trying to reach your destination. Let me break this down using Freud's famous structural model of the mind, the id, ego, and superego. Picture these as 3 roommates living in your brain. The id is like that impulsive roommate who wants instant gratification. For today's teens, this might sound like, I want to have fun, I want to be liked, I want to feel good right now. The id doesn't care about consequences. It just wants what it wants, when it wants it. The superego is the strict, judgmental roommate, the one who's internalized every expectation from parents, teachers, and society. This voice sounds like, you should get straight A's, you should get into a top college, you should be perfect, you should never fail, you should be grateful, you should be better than your peers. And caught in the middle is the poor ego, the mediator roommate who has to deal with both of these voices while also handling reality. The ego is trying to say, okay, I need to study for this test, but I also want to hang out with friends. But I also need to meet my parents' expectations. But I also need to maintain my social media presence. But I also need sleep. But there are only 24 hours in a day, and I'm already overwhelmed. No wonder today's teens are anxious. Their egos are working overtime, trying to balance impossible demands. The repression problem. What we're not talking about now, here's where Freud gets really interesting. He believed that when we can't handle certain thoughts or feelings, we push them into our unconscious through a process called repression. It's like shoving everything you don't want to deal with into a closet and slamming the door shut. Problem is, that closet gets pretty full, and eventually things start spilling out. Today's teenagers are repressing a lot. Fear of failure in a culture that glorifies success. Authentic emotions in favor of curated online personas. Normal developmental struggles because they're supposed to have it all figured out. Family pressures that they can't openly discuss. Financial anxieties about their future in an uncertain economy. Existential questions about meaning and purpose in a rapidly changing world. When these feelings get repressed, they don't just disappear, they transform. They might show up as panic attacks that seem to come out of nowhere, depression that feels like a heavy blanket you can't shake off, perfectionism that's never quite perfect enough, social anxiety that makes every interaction feel like a performance, self-harm behaviors that provide temporary relief from emotional pain. Freud would say these symptoms are the psyche's way of saying, hey, pay attention. There's something down here that needs to be addressed. Defense mechanisms in the digital age. Freud identified various defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies our minds use to protect us from anxiety and emotional pain. Let's look at how these show up in modern teen behavior. Displacement. Instead of confronting the real source of stress, like family pressure or academic anxiety, teens might lash out at friends, siblings, or even themselves. It's safer to be angry at your little brother than to admit you're terrified of disappointing your parents. Projection. Everyone else is judging me often translates to I'm judging myself harshly. When teens assume others are criticizing them, they might be projecting their own self-criticism onto the world around them. Denial. I'm fine, I don't need help is a common refrain, even when clearly struggling. This isn't stubbornness. It's a protective mechanism against acknowledging pain that feels too overwhelming to face. Sublimation. This is actually a healthy defense mechanism where difficult emotions get channeled into productive activities. The teen who writes poetry about heartbreak or throws themselves into sports when feeling angry is using sublimation. Reaction formation. Being excessively cheerful when actually depressed, or acting extremely confident when feeling insecure. Social media has made this defense mechanism almost an art form, the perfectly curated posts that hide inner turmoil. The social media superego. Here's something Freud couldn't have anticipated but would have found fascinating. Social media has essentially externalized our superego. Remember, the superego is that harsh critical voice that tells us how we should behave. But now, instead of just having one internal critic, teenagers have thousands of external ones, commenting, liking, and judging their every move. Instagram isn't just a photo-sharing app. It's a 24/7 comparison engine that feeds directly into our most primitive insecurities. TikTok isn't just entertainment. It's a constant stream of, you should be funnier, more attractive, more talented, more creative. Snapchat streaks become anxiety-inducing obligations. Freud would say that social media has created an environment where the superego never shuts up. There's no escape from judgment, no private space for authentic self-expression, no room for the messy, imperfect process of growing up. Early warning signs, what Freud would look for. If Freud were a school counselor today, he'd be looking for these early warning signs. Not just the obvious ones like grades dropping or social withdrawal, but the subtle psychological patterns. Changes in defense mechanisms, a normally honest kid who starts lying frequently, or a typically social teen who becomes overly compliant and perfect. Regression, behaviors that seem younger than their age, like a 16-year-old suddenly becoming extremely dependent on parents or reverting to childhood comfort objects. Somatic symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, or other physical complaints that don't have clear medical causes. Freud believed the body often expresses what the mind can't. Sleep and dream disruptions, changes in sleep patterns, or reports of intense, disturbing dreams can indicate unconscious conflicts coming to the surface. Repetitive behaviors, compulsive phone checking, perfectionist study habits, or other behaviors that seem driven by anxiety rather than choice. Relationship patterns, sudden changes in how they relate to authority figures, becoming either overly rebellious or excessively compliant. The academic pressure cooker. Let's talk specifically about school anxiety, because this is where so many young people are struggling. Freud would say that our education system has become a breeding ground for neurosis. Think about it. We've created an environment where a teenager's worth is measured by grades, test scores, and college admissions. We've turned learning, which should be a natural, curiosity-driven process, into a high-stakes competition where failure isn't just disappointing, it's potentially life-ruining. From a Freudian perspective, this creates what he'd call a neurotic conflict. The teenager's natural id wants to explore, play, and discover. Their developing ego wants to learn and grow at a reasonable pace, but their superego, heavily influenced by cultural messages, demands perfection, constant achievement, and flawless performance. When a student has a panic attack before a test, Freud would say that's not just about the test. That's their psyche rebelling against an impossible standard. The anxiety is their unconscious mind's way of saying, "This system is making me sick." Freudian solutions for the modern world. So what would Freud suggest we do about this crisis? His approach would be radically different from just treating symptoms. He'd want to address the underlying conflicts and repressions. Here's what that might look like. 1. Create spaces for safe expression. Freud invented the talking cure because he believed that bringing unconscious conflicts into conscious awareness was healing. Schools and families need to create spaces where teens can express their real thoughts and feelings without judgment. This doesn't mean therapy for everyone. It means regular opportunities for authentic conversation. Maybe it's a weekly check-in with a trusted teacher or family dinners where phones are put away and real feelings can be shared. 2. Normalize the struggle. Freud would say that adolescent anxiety isn't pathological, it's developmentally normal. Teenagers are supposed to be figuring out who they are, what they want, and how to navigate relationships. That process is inherently messy and anxiety-provoking. Instead of trying to eliminate all stress and discomfort, we need to help young people understand that struggle is part of growth. The goal isn't to create anxiety-free teens, it's to help them develop healthy ways of managing inevitable anxiety. 3. Address family dynamics. Freud was obsessed with family dynamics because he understood how powerfully they shape our psychology. Many teenage mental health issues can't be resolved without looking at the family system. This might mean family therapy, but it could also mean parents examining their own anxieties and expectations. Are parents unconsciously transmitting their own fears about success and failure? Are family dynamics creating pressure that teens can't openly discuss? 4. Encourage sublimation. Remember sublimation, that healthy defense mechanism where difficult emotions get channeled into productive activities. Schools and communities need to provide more opportunities for this. Art, music, drama, creative writing, sports, these aren't just extracurriculars. They're essential outlets for emotional expression. A teenager who writes angry poetry instead of self-harming is using sublimation. A student who channels competitive anxiety into debate club is finding a healthy outlet. 5. Digital detox and boundary setting. While Freud didn't have to deal with smartphones, he would definitely have strong opinions about social media's impact on mental health. He'd probably recommend regular breaks from digital platforms, not as punishment, but as necessary mental hygiene. This might mean phone-free study time, social media breaks, or family agreements about technology use. The goal is to create space between the teenager and the constant external validation, criticism of online platforms. 6. Professional help without stigma. Freud would absolutely advocate for therapy, but he'd want to change how we think about it. Instead of therapy being something you do when you're broken, it should be seen as a normal part of human development, like going to the gym for your emotional health. Schools could have counselors who use psychodynamic approaches, helping students understand the deeper patterns behind their struggles rather than just managing symptoms. The transference problem in education. Here's a fascinating Freudian concept that applies directly to schools. Transference. This is when we unconsciously transfer feelings from past relationships onto current ones. Students often transfer feelings about their parents onto their teachers, and teachers might transfer their own academic anxieties onto their students. A student who becomes defiant with a strict teacher might be working through authority conflicts from home. A teacher who becomes overly critical of a struggling student might be projecting their own fear of failure. Understanding transference could revolutionize how we handle classroom conflicts and academic struggles. Instead of just addressing behavior, we could explore the underlying emotional patterns. The Oedipus complex goes to college. Freud's Oedipus complex, the idea that children have complicated feelings about competing with and identifying with their parents, takes on new meaning in the college admissions era. Many teenagers are struggling with unconscious conflicts about surpassing their parents academically or professionally. Some students sabotage themselves because succeeding feels like betraying their family's values or leaving their parents behind. Others push themselves to dangerous extremes because they're unconsciously trying to prove their worth to parental figures. Understanding these dynamics could help families navigate the college process with more awareness of the emotional undercurrents at play. Dreams and digital natives. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, and he'd be fascinated by how digital technology affects teen dream life. Many young people report having anxiety dreams about social media, dreams where they're being publicly humiliated online, or where they can't stop scrolling no matter how hard they try. These dreams might be the unconscious mind's way of processing digital overwhelm. Paying attention to recurring dream themes could provide valuable insights into what's really troubling a teenager beneath the surface: the regression response to overwhelm. When people are overwhelmed, they often regress, reverting to earlier developmental patterns. Freud would say this is the psyche's way of retreating to a simpler time when problems felt more manageable. We're seeing this with teenagers who seem to be failing to launch, struggling with independence, relying heavily on parents, or seeming younger than their chronological age. Instead of judging this regression, Freud would see it as a signal that the current developmental demands are too overwhelming. The solution isn't to push harder, it's to create more scaffolding and support so that forward movement feels safer. Creating psychologically safe schools. If we took Freud's insights seriously, we'd design schools very differently. Instead of focusing solely on academic achievement, we'd prioritize psychological development. This might include regular opportunities for self-reflection and emotional expression, curriculum that includes psychology and emotional literacy, teachers trained in recognizing psychological distress, reduced emphasis on competition and increased focus on personal growth, spaces for creative expression and sublimation, family education about adolescent development, normalization of therapy and mental health support, the importance of meaning-making. Freud believed that psychological symptoms often emerge when life feels meaningless or when someone is disconnected from their authentic desires. Today's teenagers are growing up in a world where traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, clear career paths, are less stable than they were for previous generations. Many teens are struggling not just with anxiety and depression, but with existential questions. What's the point? Why does any of this matter? How do I make a difference in such a complex world? Addressing the mental health crisis means helping young people find authentic sources of meaning and purpose, not just external achievements, but internal satisfaction in connection to something larger than themselves. The power of listening. Finally, Freud's greatest innovation might have been simply learning how to listen. He discovered that many psychological symptoms improve just through the process of being truly heard and understood. Today's teenagers are living in a noisy world where everyone has opinions about how they should think, feel, and behave. What many of them need most is an adult who can listen without immediately trying to fix, judge, or advise. This kind of listening, what Freud called evenly hovering attention, allows young people to discover their own insights and solutions. It communicates that their inner experience matters and that they have wisdom within themselves. The ripple effect. Here's what Freud would find most encouraging about addressing this crisis. Psychological awareness creates ripple effects. When one person in a family or classroom begins to understand their unconscious patterns, it often helps others do the same. A teenager who learns to recognize and express their anxiety in healthy ways might help their friends do the same. A teacher who understands their own transference patterns might create more psychologically safe classrooms. Parents who work on their own emotional patterns might reduce the pressure they unconsciously place on their children. Closing reflection. Beyond the symptoms. As we wrap up this exploration of youth mental health through Freud's lens, let's return to Sarah, the teenager we met at the beginning. If we saw her through Freudian eyes, we wouldn't just see a kid who needs to get off social media and do her homework. We'd see a young person whose unconscious mind is trying to resolve conflicts between her authentic self and societal expectations. Her late-night scrolling isn't just procrastination. It's a compulsion driven by deeper needs for connection, validation, and escape from internal pressure. Her anxiety isn't a character flaw or a brain malfunction. It's her psyche's way of saying that something important needs attention. Maybe she's repressing fears about her future, or displacing anger about family expectations, or trying to manage an impossible balance between competing demands. If we understood Sarah's behavior as meaningful communication from her unconscious mind, we might approach her differently. Instead of just taking away her phone or adding more structure to her day, we might ask, what is this behavior trying to tell us? What does Sarah need that she's not getting? How can we help her develop insight into her own patterns? This is the real power of Freud's approach. It treats symptoms as information rather than problems to be eliminated. It assumes that human beings are inherently wise and that psychological distress usually makes sense when we understand the full context. The youth mental health crisis isn't just about brain chemistry or social media or academic pressure. Though all of those factors matter, it's about a generation of young people whose unconscious minds are rebelling against systems and expectations that don't serve their authentic development. If we want to help them, we need to do more than manage symptoms. We need to listen to what those symptoms are trying to tell us about the deeper conflicts and needs of this generation. We need to create environments where young people can explore their inner lives without judgment, express their authentic feelings safely, and find meaningful ways to channel their emotional energy. We need to remember that anxiety and depression, while painful, are often signs of sensitivity, intelligence, and depth. The teenagers who are struggling most might be the ones who are most aware, consciously or unconsciously, that something isn't working in our current systems. If we can help them understand their own psychology, develop healthy coping strategies, and find authentic sources of meaning and connection, we won't just be treating mental health issues. We'll be raising a generation that's more emotionally intelligent, more psychologically aware, and better equipped to create healthier systems for themselves and their own future children. That's not just mental health treatment. That's prevention, empowerment, and hope for the future. Because here's what Freud understood that we sometimes forget. The goal isn't to create people who never struggle. The goal is to help people understand their struggles well enough that they can work with them rather than being overwhelmed by them. And that understanding, it starts with listening, really listening, to what our unconscious minds are trying to tell us through the language of symptoms, dreams, behaviors, and emotions. The teens who are struggling today aren't broken. They're trying to communicate something important about what it means to grow up in this particular moment in history. If we can learn to hear that communication and respond with wisdom rather than just intervention, we might discover that this mental health crisis contains the seeds of a more psychologically sophisticated and emotionally healthy future. After all, sometimes a breakdown is actually a breakthrough waiting to happen. Freud would have found that idea absolutely fascinating.